So in our scripture readings today, we had stories of two different examples of call. God calling someone. In the Hebrew Bible reading, we had the example of God calling Abram, the patriarch who was at the root of three Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And then in the New Testament, in the Gospel, we had the reading of Jesus calling Matthew, who at the time was a tax collector. And we get very, very little in the story about Matthew. Really just a line or two. And this is the way it typically is throughout the Bible. We really just get the most important parts of any story. Because, of course, writing things down back in the day was costly and labor-intensive. Fun fact, on the earliest papyri that we have, there are no spaces between even the words in any of the scriptures because, of course, they were saving paper. They were saving papyrus. It was so precious. So they needed to get as many words as they could and as many ideas as they could put down. So we often just get the very, very most important parts of any story. So there's a lot that we don't get to know, a lot of details that would change the story one way or the other for pretty much anything you read in the Bible. And yet, with these most important parts, we can do something. With this story about Matthew, we know Matthew was sitting at a table in Capernaum. He was on duty as a tax collector. He was on the job. Jesus saw him, said, "Follow me." And Matthew got up, left his work, and followed Jesus. I am so curious about all the details that are missing in this story, because as it stands, it's a little strange. But here's what I can tell you historically to color it in a little bit. Becoming a tax collector was effectively a business transaction. Individuals who wanted to be a tax collector would buy the right to collect taxes in a specific region or over a specific trade, like fishing, for example. And then they would hire subcontractors, keeping whatever extra money they had extorted from the public. There were chief tax collectors, like Zacchaeus. If you know the story of Zacchaeus, he was a chief tax collector. He was the contractor. And then there were subcontractors like Matthew. So the government, the Roman government, only required an agreed upon sum as a tax. Tax collectors generated their income and built massive wealth by charging the local population inflated amounts and then keeping the difference for themselves. Now, because they had Roman authority enforcing their demands, citizens had really no power to speak of to dispute any of the charges. You can imagine this led to extortion, fraud, embezzlement, nothing good. Furthermore, because these collectors were local Jewish people in this particular area, working for an occupying foreign empire, they were widely despised as traitors and extortionists. In Jewish society at the time, they were so heavily associated with dishonesty that they were routinely grouped in the same category as quote-unquote sinners and outcasts. And remember, this had a very specific meaning at this time. These were people who were not allowed in the temple because of their sin, of their uncleanness. And this could range from kind of ritual impurity, which could pass and was not necessarily like what we would think of as a defect in character, to things like being a tax collector and extorting your own community under the authority of the Roman Empire. So these were not just like When we see sinners in the New Testament, it's not just like, oh, people who, I don't know, drink too much or swear a lot or something. Like, this is a class of people who were not allowed in the temple because of being unclean. Now, a lot of you have probably heard me explain that before. But the difference between what we think of as a tax collector, like a bureaucrat at the IRS, and a tax collector in the Gospels is so great, I always feel like I want to explain it again, because it is a really different importance. It reminds us, or it reminds me, of how absolutely scandalous it would be for a Jewish rabbi first to talk to a tax collector, second, to invite him to follow him, third, to continue to hang out with him in public, as Jesus did with Matthew, and finally, to actually make him an apostle, like a teacher of the whole message. And I think it's important to note, Jesus does not ask everyone he meets to follow him. There are actually quite a few people. There's even kind of one famous example, someone who says, I'm gonna follow you, and Jesus says, no, go home. You gotta wonder about that. I always think it's just kind of like a sign of mercy, because that person who asked that question was like just healed from a terrible disease. And I always thought Jesus was like, no, go home and enjoy life a little bit. Like you don't need to hurt yourself. So he doesn't ask everyone to follow him. So I'm so curious what it was about this particular person, Matthew, a tax collector sitting at a booth. What was it that made Jesus say, yep, that's the one? And vice versa. I wonder what it was about Jesus that made Matthew say, peace out, lucrative business opportunity. I'm not even going to finish my shift. Maybe you can think, what are the things in your life that have made you decide that the time is now to leave one thing and move on to another thing? Maybe we're talking jobs, relationships, living situations, or maybe we're talking whole worldviews, which can happen. I was thinking this week about 12-step programs and how they often use the term rock bottom in 12-step programs. There's this idea that when you are in recovery, or when you are kind of in substance abuse, until you hit this place of rock bottom, there's no or very little chance that you're actually going to be able to make a decision that sticks to get out of the claws of the substance abuse. Without hitting the rock bottom, the desire and the will to move to sobriety simply isn't there, because there's always another option. So rock bottom, it's a scary place. It can be a generative place too. Another phrase that we use is the end of your rope. In my experience, when you realize you're at the end of your rope, you often realize that it's time to do or be something different. Doesn't make it pleasant, but it is a generative space. Of course, it can also be a dangerous place. When we are at rock bottom, when we've exhausted every option, every avenue, and have no one else to turn to, we are deeply vulnerable. There are people that prey on people who are in this space, right? There's so many people, so many things, communities that would say, follow me, that often do not have the best interests at heart of the people they are calling. I think about this a lot for the various college students that we have. None of them are here today, but your freshman year of college, you're so vulnerable. And there's research that in that first year of college is when students are the most vulnerable to cults, right? Because you don't have your community, you don't have your friends, you feel alone. And then there's this group saying, we have all of that for you, and it can make you very vulnerable to that. Siren songs can easily be mistaken for the sacred voice of life that is God. But back to this idea of calling. We often think of calling as some big dramatic thing. and moreover, that has a real sense of clarity to it. And to be honest, the stories today are part of the reason why we often think that. God calling Abraham, it just seems so clear, right? Pick everything up and move, Abram, it's time to go. Jesus calling Matthew, this man who is despised by so many, who just picks up and leaves, although we don't know many of the details. But honestly, in my own experience, and maybe it's like this for you, interpreting a summons from God rarely, if ever, is a once and done thing. So I have to wonder, how many times each of these guys, Matthew and Abram, how many times prior to this thing that got written down had they actually felt a little tug, a little pull, a little whisper, but then thought, nah, that's too much work, or no way, that's not even possible at my age, or who am I to think that I could do that? Or what's wrong with me that I don't want to stay where I am in this great life? So from what I can glean from my life and from others who I've accompanied on this journey, a divine summoning often starts quite really no reason why I should want to. I just want to. Sometimes it sounds like I need to simplify, or I need to be with my grief, or maybe most commonly, I need help. Responding to divine beckoning, I think, is almost always more like following a trail of breadcrumbs, with absolutely no idea in the beginning what you're starting, because if you knew, you wouldn't pick up that first breadcrumb. When I think of my own path to ordained ministry, which is unfortunately often where we use the word calling, but certainly not the only place where God calls people. Anyway, my own journey, I think probably the most pivotal moment was a time when I decided to ask someone a question that was burning in my heart instead of following the social script of small talk. Just a very small moment. Without that moment, I'd probably be playing harp for a living. Wouldn't be a bad life. There are many, many stories of people being called to do things in the Bible, and pretty much always they resist. That can make it seem like being called is always something miserable. But it's more that I think being called to something always has an element of unknowingness to it, alongside a deep wanting. Like Abram, wanting children of his own, even though he was advanced in age. And it didn't make sense to want that thing anymore. I do think divine calling always has an element of deep wanting. But it's a desire in us that is so great or so unfitting to who we understand ourselves to be that there is an element of fear about it. For what it's worth, at this point in my life, that little twinge of fear is often what makes me pay attention now. Because I've been through the process so many times, that little bit of fear is what makes me pay attention to whatever the thought or feeling is. Now, you might be thinking, what is she even talking about? This divine calling business, I'm just a regular person. I don't have spiritual dreams. I don't hear the voice of God or see angels. I'd like to remind you that neither did Matthew, at least in the story that we have. What Matthew experienced was a person walking by, a person who saw something in him that other people did not see, and extended an invitation to him. And as for Abram, the story says God spoke to him, but if you've ever wrestled with a longing that would not leave you alone, or a dream that would not stop returning, a possibility that refused to disappear no matter how impractical it seemed, then perhaps you do know more of God's voice than you think you do. One of the themes that's important running through both of these stories is that neither person is entirely satisfied with the life he already has. Abram has security, family, possessions, but is also longing for a future he cannot create for himself. Matthew has money, stability, and power, but something in him is apparently willing to walk away from all of it. Perhaps most importantly, they are both aware that they are looking for something else. And that may be the most important thing, because when we feel that awareness that something isn't right, we so quickly want to cover it up. We so quickly want to buy something or do something to make that feeling go away. And it seems like the most important step in any divine calling is actually acknowledging that feeling of, I think I want something, or I think I need something. So we are often taught to distrust our deepest longings, to treat them as selfish or unrealistic or dangerous. But I do think those deepest longings are precisely where God begins speaking. Not every desire is a calling, but every calling begins as a desire for healing, a desire for beauty, a desire to make something, a desire to tell the truth, or a desire to help, to serve. So I suggest that the question for this week is not, what is God calling me to do with my life? That's too big a question for most of us. I think the better question is, what invitation keeps returning? What curiosity won't leave me alone? What desire have I been dismissing because it seems impractical, embarrassing, too late, or too small? And what would happen if instead of demanding this all makes sense right now, I simply took the next step? Abram did not know where the road would lead. Matthew did not know where follow me would end. I mean, sometimes I wonder, like, was Jesus just saying, follow me, I know a good place to, get a drink or something? Boy, what a decision. Most of us never get the kind of certainty that either of these two people got. But the life of faith, of course, has never been about seeing the whole picture. It has always been about just trusting the next breadcrumb. Thanks be to God.